decided yet.
But see, this is why I go back to the question being clear,
Right.
because the question about the impact of exposure on eventual proficiency is a very deep and complicated question. And it can be answered, but it would take, I don't know if you have time in a honors thesis to do that.
So that's why I suggested like a retrospective with adults who are multilingual, and then asking them about their childhood and saying, what was it like in your household? And then I like making it really specific about, in your household,
domains
what
of
languages
use
for use for blah, 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 blah.
Right.
And then now in your life. And then you're not trying to make an argument about, because the person was spoken to in French, English, and Spanish, today they speak French, English, and Spanish, because you cannot measure that. But you can say, here's a multilingual speaker of French, English, and Spanish who was spoken to in English in the home, right, Spanish at school, and then got French, on vacations. And today, that same person uses those things in similar ways.
Right, and this is why domains of use is important, because exposure, exposure comes from many different sources. Exposure in the home, what we call interpersonal communication skills, is different from exposure in a classroom. So you get multiple sources of exposure to language in your early childhood. It could be in the home. It could be sort of incidental, picking up from media, social media, and so forth, and also from formal classroom instruction. Or it could simply be a kind of a heritage language where you have receptive understanding, but not necessarily matched by productive skills. So exposure itself has to be parsed as well, the quality and quantity of the exposure. I think what's more doable is a kind of a retrospective, where if you're looking at them now, describing the language practices, but not making a claim that A predicted B or cause, because that would require very complex work in psycholinguistics and quantitatively measuring that. And even for experienced researchers, quantitatively measuring how this produces this level of proficiency is often very challenging.
Yeah, you'd have to like set your own experiment, right?
You have to set your experiment, and you would have to define the construct of proficiency.
Because there are so many variables.
There's so many variables. You would have to, which we're still struggling with in
linguistics.
I mean, my doctorate is in linguistics, and we're still struggling in linguistics of how does one define proficiency? How proficient is proficient? When people claim to be bilingual, that means a whole host of things.
Every person probably has their own definition.
I mean, there's a continua of bilingualism, but there's not a bilingual state that is fixed. There are degrees of. So when I say, "Oh, I speak French and Spanish," well, how well? How much? When? In what context? To what degree? Do I just speak it casually? Can I write my doctoral thesis in French?
Exactly.
Right.
So I speak a language is extremely vague.
And if I've been speaking Spanish for the past 3 months because I have a Spanish-speaking friend, but then I don't speak Spanish for 6 months, my level of proficiency qualitatively changes, right? Because of the exposure and the practice. If I'm like when I was doing research in a Head Start with Spanish speakers, my Spanish was awesome. Now my Spanish is like, I can tell somebody where to go from the subway from A to B, but I couldn't have those same conversations that I was having just 2 years ago. I couldn't have them right now because I'm not.
Well, this is why it's probably more doable to document actual practices, because the question you ask is a great question, but I think the practicality of doing it within the constraint of this course, now that I found it is 0 credit, I have to,
Especially.
This will be a cabinet discussion tomorrow.
Exactly.
I'm not suggesting that you trivialize the work, but I'm suggesting that you all do your work within things that are doable and feasible.
Right.
It has to be feasible within the limitations of time and resources that you have. So maybe a modification might be looking at their actual practices and kind of describing that in terms of a comparison of the early exposure that they had. How does that compare with your practices now?
Right.
I mean, you can do a comparison. How does your early exposure compare with your
that's a good way to
perceptions
put it.
of your early exposure? How does that compare with your practices now? Without making a claim that one was a predictor of the other. So I think that's more situated, more concrete, and very doable, feasible even.
Or like students who learn a second or a third language in their school versus like in their home. And like how is that? Yeah.
Right. So I mean, so you when your broad question is about the practices in early childhood, but then your actual, so you want to distinguish between the research question and then your interview questions, which are questions, the answers to which go to your broader research question. So the broader question might be the exposure of practices in early childhood, but then how do you get to that? Then you have to ask about what was the nature of that practice in early childhood? Where did you learn the language in early childhood? Was it at home? Was it in school? How often? So those are the actual survey questions that you get to answer your broader question about early childhood practices. Do you see what I mean? So detailed questions are on the survey. Your research questions are broader.
Okay.
So your detailed questions should answer your bigger question, if you get what I mean. Yeah. So when I ask my questions about the current state of awareness of the Jamaican teachers, that's my research question. But when I sit down with a teacher, I have to ask, were you aware of their policy? What do you think of the idea of a policy? Those are what I ask in the interview to address the answer to my bigger research question. So there's a difference between the research question and the interview or survey questions. Those are the details that will fill out the research question. I don't know, are we running out of time?
We're getting close, yeah, but I mean, I hope, even though we were focusing on like particular, like sort of workshopping one situation, the idea of specificity, the idea of like really concretely, what am I actually trying to measure? What am I actually trying to...
What am I asking?
Ask, and then
measure.
How can I answer that? So can I really answer this question that I think is my research question? Can I actually answer this question at the end of the day? Even if the answer is no. That's a better answer than no answer. And if there's no answer, then there's a design problem, right? So a no, there was no impact of my intervention. In both of your cases, your interventions. My intervention had no impact. Okay, well, your intervention had no impact. That's an answer.
That's an answer.
As opposed
to nothing.
Right.
So your design has to be such that there is something answerable, if you will. And the other thing which I said earlier was the more options of data collection you have, it gives you a little more cushion so that if the question can be answered both by survey and or observation, that's great because I could do that.
Like Brittany, you might interview teachers as well, right? In addition to doing it, you might ask teachers, how do you think, how have you used art, or do you think that art helps, or does that matter to you, or do you think it's important, or whatever? You can ask those kinds of questions. You can ask questions too, like you could do smaller things, and Ala, we talked about, say she would do surveys with like maybe, I don't know, say 20 kids per se, but then interview 3 of them really in depth and really
So you could survey, which are called the focal participants. So that's another way to get at depth, right? You could survey 25 people, but then of those 25, some patterns jump out at you, and then you figure, okay, I'm going to zero in on 2 or 3 people and focus on them for more in depth, and that's a very common design that lots of studies do. One last question is managing your data. Be very disciplined about that. If you interview, try to get your interviews transcribed as soon as possible after the interview. Make sure your tape recorder is high quality, so that there's not a lot of noise in the background. These are logistics that are important. You don't want you want high quality tapes. You keep a kind of running note record of your work. So as things jump out at you, you should have a file just for like side notes.
They're called methodological notes.
They're called methodological notes or memos, where a separate document, Word document, or however you file your stuff, with your methodological notes. It's like, so things that you're noticing along the way that you just want to file, you want to put in notes, and sometimes they're called memos or methodological notes.
I called it my research diary. If there's no, the methodology, that's like that's the official name in your publication. You can call it whatever you want, but it's something that's separate from your actual data. It's your thoughts. As you're going along, you have an insight. You go, this was a really interesting thing that happened in this interview today. And you write that down. Something
jumped out at you during the interview or the survey, you put that in your notes there. So you keep that. Those little aha moments, those insights that you have, you want to make note. And you have to have good organizational skills. You have to manage your data. And you have to stay on top of it right away. date everything. Everything should have the date. I interviewed John on November 9, 2012 at 2:30 p.m. You know, document your stuff meticulously, have a date on everything, organize it by, okay, here are all my interviews in this file. Here are all my survey data in this file. Here, and then what's great is if you use any software, they can sort of look at relationships for you. I'm not suggesting you do that, but
we'll get to
that. You're not getting to that level. You're not there yet. But at a basic level, keep your stuff clean, organized, and dated. And so it should be very clear to you, this set of data is for my research question number 1. This set of data is for my research question number 2. So that you have a system that is recognizable, makes sense. It will make your write-up so much easier. Because to the extent that you have data addressing each question, it's like your write-up will be right there when you write it up.
Right.
So that is up to you. You have to be a manager of your data, and you have to take it seriously, and you have to organize it, and you have to get so familiar with it that it becomes part of you. So that you have to really get into the data and really own it, and then your writing up in the end will be much better because you will be clear about what you saw and what you found because you are familiar with your data, and you also link it to your literature review, which you have to do, right? Right. So as you are with your data, think of how it makes connection to the existing literature out there, so that it kind of makes sense. Awesome. I think I'm way over time.
But that's okay. Thank you so much.
Hopefully it was helpful.
Yeah, that was really, really fabulous. Right.
Okay. There are extra handouts. You can keep them.